Let's start with this presentation. It's the last one of the webinar cycle we have been doing during all June and July. And it's kind of like the last frontier, the fermentation of a neutral alcohol-based NAB for hard seltzer production. So the agenda of today, it's quite a long agenda, and I would say that the first 4 points are there mainly for our international audience. I know that all the people here in the United States are very familiar with the hard seltzers. However, outside of the United States, hard seltzers are not very well known, and actually not a lot of people have had the chance to try them. So I'm going to explain first the hard seltzer eruption in the alcohol beverage category, and then I'm going to talk about like where does hard seltzers come from. We're going to explain a few TTB and taxes regulation here in the United States. What are hard seltzers? How do you produce a neutral alcohol base? And then I would say from point 6 to 9, we're going to go into the meat of this presentation, which is how you ferment a pure sugar wash. I'm going to show you and walk you through how we develop a premium nutrient for neutral alcohol-based fermentation. I'm going to show you some industrial trials results from the United States that we did with some customers. So large trials like 50, 60, or even higher batch size trials. And then I'm going to walk you through other products that we have in the Fermentis product range for hard seltzers. So for the people that is not familiar with the hard seltzers, a few sales data. So I will first say, so first here you have the data from 2018 in millions of dollars. And here you have the data of 2019. Just by quickly looking at this slide, I think it's the other way around. 2019 should be higher than 2018. But what I want to say here is that we have seen in the hard seltzer category a huge and exponential growth. So if you follow some beverage medias like Beverage Daily or Brewbound, you can find a lot of articles about seltzer and some crazy numbers, like, for example, seltzers are expected to double in sales to 3.5 billion by 2020. So this year we'll see where we are at the end of the year with all the COVID-19 pandemic, and this number is even crazier. They expect sales to be around $6.5 billion by 2024. So when we look at percentages, just growth of this beverage in the alcohol category has been 3 digits in the last years, which is something unheard of in the industry. So quite interesting. A few more numbers here in the US. In 2019, hard seltzers accounted for 2.6% of 2.6% volume of total alcoholic beverage in the United States, and that percentage was less than 1% in 2018. So a few more numbers. If we look at the alcohol beverage category in the United States, we can see that most of it is beer, then wine, then spirits. So when we look at the 2018 numbers, and then we compare them with the 2018 numbers and 2019 numbers, we can see that the beer consumption is going down a little bit year after year. Same thing as the wine, and that is not a new trend. We have been seeing that for a long, long time. Spirits remain stable, but then when we compare the hard seltzer category and other categories that are pretty similar, like ready-to-drink beverages of FAB, FMBs, you can see that those have stayed pretty stable with like slight growth. But then when you look at hard seltzer, it's interesting how it moved from 0.8 to 2.6 in just 12 months. And last but not least, the cider category, very small and stayed pretty small as well in 2019. So a few hard seltzer milestone, if I can say, from March 2019 to March 2020, the growth was 327%. So again, I'm going to say it is mind-blowing. I was reading an article, and Jim Koch, who is the founder of Boston Beer Company, said there is a microphone. Someone has a microphone on. Just if you can turn it off. So as I was saying, Jim Koch from Boston Beer Company said that, yeah, we haven't seen this, a product with such a growth in the alcohol beverage industry in the last 40 years. So it's quite a phenomenon. And players in the hard seltzer category are White Claw, that belongs to Mark Anthony brand, and Truly, that belongs to Boston Beer Company. So these two players actually account for 85% of the whole hard seltzer category market in the United States, and some more data, like 53% of White Claw consumers are women and 47% are men's. So I'd like to point out something here that is quite interesting. Mark Anthony brand and Boston Beer Company are not major beverage companies. So it's interesting that the hard seltzer category was developed by somehow smaller players in the beverage industry in comparison with major brands like, for example, Diageo, ABI, Miller's, Heineken, Carlsberg, to mention a few ones. Also, again, going through more data, what we have seen in bars and restaurants, that consumption of this beverage is going up. So it's not on draft, but you can buy at the restaurant a can of seltzer if you want. We have a lot of young demographic drinking this beverage, so Generation Z, very young people. And also we found some review that seems that some spirit consumers are turning to hard seltzers. So again, last but not least, something interesting, 46% of the consumers drink hard seltzer as such, but 35% blend them in a cocktail, and it seems that 35% blend them with some kind of spirits. So, as we know, the alcohol beverage category as a whole, with wine, beer, cider, spirits, the total volume of alcohols worldwide, some kind is not growing, and we're seeing the hard seltzer, even if the volume today is small, 2.6%, but is growing quite a bit. So if the hard seltzer category is growing, like which category is decreasing? And we found out that actually quite few consumers of hard seltzer come, for example, from light beers, 25% of them. Others, 11% come from premium beer, which is, for example, Budweiser. 9% of the hard seltzer consumer comes from the craft beer. So hard seltzers are also digging into the sales of craft beer. And also hard seltzers are digging into the sales of imported beer. So when you add up all these percentage, you realize that 53% of hard seltzer consumers come from the beer category, which is not a little bit, but kind of, yeah, a little bit over than half of all hard seltzer consumer are drinking hard seltzers instead of drinking beer. So, which brings us to like the following points, which is, where those hard seltzers come from? Like why hard seltzers? And I apologize, it's not the best picture quality. I took this picture last year at HomebrewCon in Rhode Island, and the Brewers Association was going through a review of a lot of data about what are the trends in the beer industry and what consumers are looking at. And I found this slide very interesting. And this comes from a survey called Mindful Drinking. And they run a survey asking people question, what are you looking for when you drink? And on this column here, you have the age of group people, so 21, 24, which is Generation Z. 25, 34, which is more millennials, and 35, 44. So I apologize for all the people that are over 44 years old, but they were not taken in account in this survey. And the reason is because baby boomers have been studied as a generation so much that I think we have all the data we want about them, but we don't have the data about this younger demographic. And like these young people that today are actually most of them 21 years old, so they can legally drink in the United States, they want to drink a product that is low calories, that is aligned with their fitness goal, that it's organic, that is low carbohydrate, that is non-alcoholic, or that is low in ABV. So forget about the imperial stout, barley wine, IPA, or any kind of extreme beer. They care that it's made with local ingredients, and also, well, again, that it's low ABV, and also they care to some extent that it's gluten-free. So what we can see here is that there is a demand for a healthier drink, a kind of clean label. I'm going to explain later what I mean by a clean label, but this is interesting. We want to have a buzz from what we're drinking. So people are open to have some alcohol, but then I want the alcohol, but I don't want the calories from the sugar of that drink, or I don't want, I don't want alcohol and calories, which can be sugar, and also I don't want the carbohydrates. So, long story short, there is a demand by a generation that for a low alcohol drink, 5% ABV, low in calories, low in sugar, vegan, and gluten-free. And if you look at what these brands like Mark Anthony with White Claw and Buster Beer and Company would truly have done, is exactly that. They have canned the beverage that has some alcohol, so not a lot, 5% ABV, that has low calories, like 100 calories in a can is not a lot, almost no sugar, and actually it's vegan and gluten-free. So really, when we look at all the conditions here that people want, and we look at the beverage, it's specifically targeted to a specific demographic or people looking for that. But before hard seltzers, I would say that we saw this coming. Since 2019, the sales of seltzers in the US start to grow quite a bit, and I think everyone in the US knows a brand called LaCroix, and it's what is the benchmark. Everybody drinks that, and so we saw that for a while, since 2019, so almost a decade ago, seltzer sales to really skyrocket. And a seltzer like LaCroix is pretty much a hard seltzer without alcohol. So again, you have a carbonated beverage that don't have alcohol, but also has the fizziness of the CO2 and have a lot of different aromas, pretty much as many as you want. I mean, you can see all the different aromas here on the top right of the screen. So when we talk about these hard seltzer phenomena, we can like see where companies like Mark Anthony with White Claw took the inspiration from. You know, it just take a seltzer and add some buzz and make it funnier, I guess. So what do I mean by a clean label? I mean, that's not a scientific term. It's not my it's not something I came up with. If you Google it, you will find many definitions. But long story short, is a marketing terminology, and it means that the product you are buying is made with as less ingredient as possible, and pretty much with ingredients that you will use at home. And Sorry, give me a second. Okay. And I lost my pointer, but I think you can see the arrow. So with a clean label, as I was saying, a product made with less ingredients as possible. And this company have really take that philosophy to the packaging. So you can see on the screen here that a hard seltzer like Truly stayed low ABV. It tells you the amount of calories it has and also the amount of sugar. And as you can see, white, a white cardboard, and pretty much they tell you this beverage has just a few little things like no artificial sweeteners, natural flavoring, low ABV, and so on. So for our international audience, I would say these are the major other brands that we see in the market. Beside Truly from Boston Beer Company, Pabst came out with a seltzer. Henry's, which belongs to Miller Core, Diageo with Spiked Seltzer. And also I will mention some really early attempts to the seltzer markets, like the one from Wachusett Brewing Company, which was one of the former seltzers in the US with nutty seltzers. And now Corona also launched a seltzer brand. So we can see that everybody now wants to be part of the hard seltzer movement. And actually the hard seltzer movement has gone beyond the US. The other day, checking Beverage Daily, I think this is from February, there was a news about Carlsberg going into the hard seltzer market in Europe, and talking with a colleague, Fermentis colleague from the APAC region, they were telling me that Lion King also came out with a seltzer in Australia. So companies are really emulating worldwide what they have seen in the US, and I think this year and next year is going to be very exciting to see what the seltzer market is doing beyond the US. So hard seltzer production, it's regulated in the United States, but it's not the case in many countries. So I'm going to give the example of what it is in the US to give you an idea. So hard seltzer for the TTB are alcoholic beverages that contain carbonated water, alcohol, and often fruit aromas that can be natural or artificial, but most of the people are making seltzer with natural aromas. So hard seltzer are classified as beer in the United States, which was not always the case, but now it is. The ancestor of hard seltzer was FMBs, fermented malt beverages. So as I was saying, a seltzer can be produced from a malt base, but today what we see is that most seltzers are produced 100% sugar fermentation to make them gluten-free, right? To advise, actually from domestic audience, check TTB, state, and FDA regulations. I learned not long ago watching another NAB and seltzer presentation that in Oregon, for example, you need a wine license to make hard seltzer, as hard seltzers are classified as wine. So you have to be sure that you meet the TTB regulation, but also your state regulations. And an advice for an international audience is please check your local regulations. We know that up to today, in many countries, this is not regulated, but it will be soon. That always happens. So try to be proactive and not reactive when you design your recipes. A few more things about TTB. So here in the US, most hard seltzers are made with sugar from cane or corn, and actually we ferment those sugars to make the seltzer. So the interesting thing here is that if you ferment a pure sugar solution, it's taxed as it was beer. So that's why I say here that most seltzers here in the US are produced. So the company that is making the seltzer is producing its own alcohol with pure sugar wash, and it's not formulated. So if it was formulated, that will mean that you will be buying alcohol, distilled alcohol, 96%, from a supplier, and then dilute that and carbonate it and add flavors. And if you do that, you pay a lot more taxes because taxes on pure alcohol are a lot higher. So there is a, I would say, tax incentive to ferment your own pure sugar wash. So I think this is 100% accurate. I hope it is, but I advise again, please check the TTB website. So for the TTB hard seltzers, so can be malt-based or sugar-based. So if it's sugar-based, it's a beer. If it's malt-based, it's an F&B or a beer. So the TTB will issue the license to produce it. The formula needs to be approved by the TTB. The label, in the case of malt-based seltzer, needs to be approved by the TTB, but in the case if it's sugar, no. Tax category, as we said, both are taxed as beer. Malt and in general grain-based liqueurs are not gluten-free, but if you have 100% sugar wash, it's gluten-free. And also labeling requirements, in the case of the malts, you go through the TTB, and in the case of sugar-based, 100% sugar-based, you go through the TTB and FDA. So to put it simple, what is a hard seltzer? So you can see that the screen is split in two, and in the middle, I just look for a nice picture of a White Claw hard seltzer, and you can see that in the glass we have a crystal clear liquid that is carbonated and no foam. So how do I get there? I think there are two main routes. The first one is to ferment a low to medium gravity neutral alcohol base. So you want that base to be flavorless, colorless, really crystal clear, like what you can see here in this glass, and you add to that flavor. So you reach out to a flavoring house and you choose one of the many flavors they have. So starting point here, low to medium gravity neutral alcohol base. But also you can go a more efficient route, and you can produce a high gravity neutral alcohol base that again you want to be flavorless and colorless. That then you're going to dilute, ideally with deaerated water, but then that's it. It's an ideal word. You can use regular water, but not ideal. And then you're going to add flavors, and of course, in both cases, this is a highly carbonated beverage. So this case, technically more complicated, but more efficient. On the left of the screen here, you're fermenting a base to reach 5% ABV, so no dilution needed. So pretty much after fermentation, you are all set with your base for flavoring and carbonation. So what I am looking for in a neutral alcohol base, as I said, and I put a lot of emphasis into this because it's not easy to do. It's a lot easier to put this sentence on a PowerPoint than in real life. Make a neutral alcohol base that is free of flavor, free of long chain alcohols, which are superior alcohols, free of esters and other volatile compounds, that is colorless or has as little color as possible. And to sum up, like a neutral alcohol base should be close to water, so crystal clear, but the only difference with water is that here we have alcohol. So let's move into how do I produce a neutral alcohol base. And I would say that it's, on the paper, a lot more simpler than to make other beverages, because you need very little ingredients. So you need sugar. That can be saccharose, can be dextrose, can be sugar cane, can be corn syrup. Point of attention with corn syrup is that a lot of corn here in the United States can be GMO, and the people that are drinking these beverages, I'm not sure they are looking to have a GMO ingredient there, so careful with that. And we have seen some customers starting to develop neutral alcohol base using molasses. But I will say that what we see more often is people using saccharose, dextrose, or this kind of sugarcane. So we need water to do this fermentation, and the advice is like use your brewing water. That's what's needed. And also we need yeast. So for high gravity, actually, we recommend 2 overstrain, one of them being Spirit HG1 and the other one being Red Star Premier Cuvée. So this is the 2 strains we recommend for high gravity. And later in the presentation, I will talk about in details. I will show you a few trials with both of them. So what are the technical limitations when I am brewing neutral alcohol base? And I made a parallel with the beer because usually the beer wort is there to make the yeast happy to produce a good beer. So in the beer wort, we have a media that is rich in nutrients, is rich in minerals, is rich in flavor, precursors, and color. And all that the color comes from the malt, and the flavor precursors come from the malt, as well as the hops. And when you look on the other side of the slide, there is a warning sign, because in a pure sugar wash, actually, besides sugar, there is anything. Like, it's really, I think the next time I will change the picture here from an empty glass. I mean, there are no nutrients, there are no minerals. We know that the pH is going to go down during the fermentation to a level that can compromise the fermentation. And also, there is, of course, not a lot of flavor precursors. And like, if there is some color that might be coming from the dilution of sugar in warm water, that is going to create some caramelization, but there should not be a lot of color. So what are the main problems during the fermentation of a neutral alcohol base for hard seltzer production? We see a lot of stuck and sluggish fermentation. And when you dive a little bit to understand what happened, and for example, run a cell count, you realize that actually there is not too many cells, so low biomass production. That is explaining why the fermentation is stuck or sluggish. There is also a dramatic drop in the pH, and yeast below 3 pH will not ferment. And I would say at 3.5 is really feeling highly uncomfortable. So I put a reminder here. Actually, in the beer wort, organic acids give the beer wort a buffering capacity, and you have there the order of the acid that help the most with that, and we don't have that in the sugar solution when we're fermenting a neutral alcohol base. So to put it simple, how we can achieve actually the production of a high gravity neutral alcohol base, you have to put the right yeast in the right media or environment. So I put simple, right? Yeah, it's super simple to put it on paper, but to make it happen, it's a lot more complex, and we will see that. But also, through the fermentation of the neutral base, there will be some color, there will be some aroma production, and that's expected. It's something that happens in fermentation, very little in the case of neutral alcohol base. But hard seltzers, or the base for hard seltzers, the alcohol base for hard seltzers, it's clean downstream. I will go into that later, deactivated carbon, for example, or X-flow for the fancy facilities. So it's a product that needs some cleaning before being blended and carbonate. But a key point here is that In fermentation, the less aroma you produce, that means that the less cleaning you have to do downstream. So you're going to save time and money. Like cleaning a product is not cheap. You need deactivated carbon or X-flow or many things to clean alcohol in this case. So we're going to start to look a little bit more in detail what's going on with the fermentation in a high gravity neutral alcohol base. And I put a reminder here that why it says beer wort. And I think if in the audience we have a lot of brewers, you are familiar with the yeast growth course. So we're not going to spend we're not going to spend a lot of time here, but there is a lag phase, as you know, then there is an exponential phase, and actually through the exponential phase, you can see that the amount of cells is growing quite a bit. Then we have a stationary phase. And then, of course, yeast start to die, so the amount of viable cells decrease. So this happened in the beer wort because it's a good environment for the yeast to grow. So we'll see it later, in particular in some trials we ran in a pure sugar solution, because you don't have pretty much anything beside glucose. You will not see this growth if you don't have a nutrient. You will just see a flat line all across the board, and you can wait and wait and wait and wait and wait, and there will not be biomass production. And if there is not biomass production, you will see that your original gravity will stay pretty much the same through the days, through the whole fermentation. So let's look in details at the fermentation of a pure sugar wash. So a few reminders here, and I'm going to go super fast. On the slide, you have the equation of the sugar glucose, C6H12O6. So the glucose transformation into alcohol. And here you have that a mole of glucose is 180 grams. And in the perfect world with 100% efficiency, that mole of glucose produces 2 moles of ethanol and 2 moles of CO2. As we know, fermentation is not 100% efficient. So efficiency is less than 100%. And the reason for that is because the yeast needs energy to transform the sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide, but also the yeast produce a lot more than those two components. So ethanol and carbon dioxide are the main two components produced, but actually the yeast is producing a lot of other metabolites like ester, fatty acid, long chain alcohols, super alcohols, organic acids, sulfur compounds, aldehyde, biomass, etc. So here, pretty much same slide as before, but what we wanted to show here is actually, well, you have different sugars. So this again is a reminder from a beer wort. So you have glucose here, you have maltose here, you have maltodextrose here, and the yeast is assimilating very easily some of these sugars in a specific transporter for others, and is going to digest them through glycolysis to produce, of course, energy and many other components that you can see here, like ethanol, CO2, and other metabolites that then will be excreted outside the cell. So now I need your attention because this is going to become very interesting. Or at least I think for me it becomes very interesting. Okay, so imagine we are in a neutral alcohol base production. So we are trying to ferment a pure sugar solution. So we decided to use saccharose, dextrose, and what we have here is just water mixed with this sugar. So I'm here, but actually what you can see on this slide is that I need a phosphorus or phosphate for example, to produce some of these compounds. And also, I need sulfur and I need nitrogen to start producing precursors that will become amino acids, sugars, fatty acids, nucleotides. And then all these building blocks will become lipids, lipopolysaccharides, glycogens, proteins. I mean, I need amino acids to make proteins. I need also nucleotides to make RNA or DNA. And these building blocks are going to become more complex things like, for example, membranes, cytosol, chromosomes. And we consider all this biomass. So the yeast, in order to grow, to make more yeast, to make happen the fermentation, you need specific components. I will call these micronutrients like phosphorus, phosphate, sulfur, or nitrogen. And without them, all this sequence that you see here, which is biomass production, will not happen. So, as the slide says, if I could turn yeast into a chemical formula, the formula will be this one, which is the percentage average dry matter of each component of the yeast. And what is the yeast actually? So a yeast is composed by 47% of carbon. So as the slide says here, is the major structural element of the cell. And what is going to be the source of carbon for the yeast in a sugar wash, in a pure sugar fermentation? Well, it's going to be the sugar that we are diluting with the water. Also, the yeast is composed by hydrogen. So the hydrogen is responsible of the proton motive force, so and also to regulate pH intracellular. The yeast is composed of oxygen that we can add to the fermentation, but also the yeast can take oxygen for many molecules. We saw that actually glucose here is composed of oxygen as well. We need nitrogen, so the yeast is 8% nitrogen, is also phosphate, phosphorus 1.2%, sulfur, and there is a lot of micronutrients in the yeast, so that falls into the category of others, 4.5%, that actually are very important because they allow a lot of enzymatic activities to happen, and the source of that is going to be the salts and minerals. Also, the source for the sulfurs can be the sulfates or amino acid. The source of phosphate is going to be phosphate, and the source of nitrogen can be different kind of salt, ammonium, for example. I have to take this out of this slide. I will explain to you later. So don't use urea as a nitrogen source. It's possible, but you shouldn't do it. Also, amino acids can be used as a nitrogen source. So where do I want to come with all these? In the next 5 slides, we're going to see, okay, if I have to design the nutrition regime for my yeast, how do I do it? Like, how do we proceed? And pretty sure people from the wine industry or with an agricultural background are used to this. I think in the beer industry, we are not that used to this because the beer world usually provides everything the yeast need. But for example, in wine fermentation, the most from wine or in cider, apple juice, most of the time, all the fruit juices are don't have all the nutrient or nitrogens that the yeast need to perform fermentation. So, as I just said before in this slide, so the yeast is mainly carbon. I'm not going to worry about the oxygen, but also I need to bring to the yeast nitrogen, phosphate, and sulfurs. Okay, so stay with me. As I said, glucose is 6 carbon, 12 hydrogen, and 6 oxygens. So 40% of the glucose molecule is carbon, 6.7% of the glucose molecule is hydrogen, and 53.3% is oxygen. So this is an exercise, and we are here thinking, okay, I need to run a fermentation. I'm going to start with a pitching rate of 50 grams per hectoliters, which is very common in the industry. And what I'm going to target here is to grow my biomass 10 times. So how much carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur I need to bring into my solution in order to allow the yeast to grow 10 times. So how do we calculate that? Excel is going to be your best friend. So build a chart. On this side here, we have the formula we came up for the yeast. So if I start with a pitching rate of 50 grams per hectoliter, that means that 23.5 grams, I will have 23.5 grams of carbon per hectoliter. So here is the same thing, but in grams per hectoliter. And as I was telling you, I want to grow the biomass 10 times. So if my pitching rate has 0.235 gram per liter of carbon, if I want to grow the biomass 10 times, I need to reach 2.35 grams per liter of the carbon molecule. So how much do I need? Well, actually, what I need is what I need to have at the end of fermentation, less what I'm bringing with the yeast I'm dumping into the fermentation vessel. So this minus this give me this. So I need 2.115 gram per liter of carbon. And you do this for all the elements, but let's start with carbon because it's the major structural component of biomass. So then when you know how much carbon you need to grow your biomass 10 times, and here I'm not saying that to produce to ferment a pure sugar solution, you need to grow the biomass 10 times. I just use the 10 factor because it's an easy example to set up. So I'm here, I need 2.115 gram per liter of carbon to achieve the fermentation I was. And then the next question is, okay, which carbon source I'm going to use? In this case, we said, hey, let's use glucose. And I know that actually glucose is 40% of carbon. So I divide my needs by 0.4, and that tells me that in order to perform this fermentation and grow the biomass 10 times, I need 5.29 gram per liter of glucose. But as we know, glucose is also hydrogen and oxygen. So if I add this quantity of glucose, I'm also going to add this quantity of hydrogen and this quantity of oxygen. But the important thing here was to cover the carbon needs in the fermentation. So carbon is covered. Now we're going to move to another key component to run a fermentation, which is nitrogen. And what is used nitrogen for in the cell? As I showed before, for many, many things, actually. Nitrogen is present in protein, is present in enzyme, is present in specific transporter proteins, is also energy, is also in the DNA. So as the slide says here, nitrogen. So we're going to talk later about mineral and organic nitrogen, but nitrogen is imperative in all fermentation steps. And this brings me to a regulatory point, and that is that avoid urea as a nitrogen source to avoid ethyl carbamate formation. So what is EC, ethyl carbamate? I took this from Davis University. It's a naturally occurring component of all fermented food and beverages. Because ethyl carbamate has shown a potential for carcinogenity when administered in high doses in animal tests, the example is from the wine industry, the wine industry is interested in reducing EC level in their products. So ethyl carbamate has a carcinogenic effect, so we don't want that. And also, this is interesting, urea can spontaneously react with the alcohol in wine, but also in beer, but also in a pure sugar fermentation or in a cider fermentation, in any kind of alcohol fermentation. Urea can react with alcohol to form ethyl carbamate. And this reaction is exponentially accelerated at elevated temperatures. And you will see later that for the production of neutral alcohol base, we ferment at really high temperatures. So point of attention, and also I put a policeman here because in more and more countries, this is starting to be regulated. So I didn't look in depth of the state of the ethyl carbamate regulation through the world, but here we have a few countries that state regulations and levels in ppb for different beverages. But long story short, we don't want ethyl carbamate in a pure sugar solution, so avoid using urea as a nitrogen source. And you can ask me, why will I use urea? Well, because it's really cheap. It's a fertilizer. You can go to the Home Depot or to Lowe's and buy bags and bags and bags of it. But don't use it. Sooner or later, you will be caught. And actually, it's forbidden in many, many countries. And it's carcinogenic, so come on. All right, so going back to the nitrogen and phosphorus or phosphate I need into biomass production. Here we have the example is set up the same way as it is for glucose. And the statement, the assumption here is that I'm going to use the ammonium phosphate, DAP, to bring to the fermentation of the nitrogen and phosphorus the yeast needs. So you have the molecule here, and you can see that DAP is 21.2% of nitrogen and is 23.5% of phosphorus. Same example, we start with a pitching rate of 50 grams per hectoliters, and as you can see, the assumption, so here is in gram per hectoliter, and here is in gram per liters, and here you can see what I need at the end of fermentation. So these are my needs. So for phosphorus, phosphate, or nitrogen. And so to cover actually my nitrogen needs of this fermentation, which is growing the biomass 10 times, I need 1.7 gram per liter of DAP, which will bring me also 0.23 grams of phosphorus per liter. So this is the calculation for DAP. You can use other nitrogen source, but as was saying, the best thing is to build your spring spreadsheet and actually see how much nitrogen you have at the beginning of fermentation in a pure sugar wash. That's going to come from the yeast itself that you are pitching, and then how much you need to grow your biomass, and then you complete what's needed in the solution with a good nitrogen source. So as I said a few minutes before, we have two different, in the alcohol beverage industry, we use mainly two different sources of nitrogen. So one is DAP, which is mineral nitrogen. So it's pretty much what we are adding in the solution here. It's ammonium ions. But also there is another alternative, which is ammonium sulfate, that I will not advise that you use to cover the nitrogen needs, and I'm going to explain that later. But long story short is because it has a lot of sulfates, and you don't want a lot of sulfate in your fermentation. So how do you use the ammonium phosphate? Actually, I mean, not how I don't use it. You don't use it, actually the yeast, how the yeast use the ammonium phosphate. So this can be incorporated via direct amination to glutamate that can be later be turned into other amino acids, so through transamination reaction. So pretty much DAP can be used by all the yeast strain. So the yeast strain doesn't care from which manufacturer there are, but if you give them DAP, they're going to use it. Another way to bring nitrogen to the yeast or into a fermentation where you need nitrogen because the media don't have that nitrogen is with amino acids, and we'll talk in details later about this. But I need to set up a few bases here. And what are amino acids? There are around 20. There are small peptides. They're the base for nucleotides and nucleotide. So as you can see here, we have an amino acid that's going to make a peptide, and that's later is going to become a protein. So where do I find amino acid? I'm afraid to say that here you cannot go to Lowe's or Home Depot to buy these. Very specific people sell these, and most of the time, amino acids are produced or find, in nutrients that are derived from yeast. So that's why we're going to talk about this a lot later. Yeah. So how the yeast use the amino acid? Actually, for the yeast, it's like candy. They use it as such directly into the biosynthesis. They can convert some amino acid into others without being completely degraded. And also, amino acid can be degraded to release nitrogen, the ammonium ion or glutamate, that will be used into the biosynthesis. So in that case, the carbon released become a waste, and usually in a beer fermentation or wine fermentation, that belong an aromatic precursor for an alcohol ester or a higher alcohol, for example. So last but not least, my micronutrients for biomass or for yeast grow. As I said, I need carbon, I need nitrogen, phosphate, but also, as I showed now many slides before, I also need sulfur. So in this case, to complete the fermentation needs, we're going to use ammonium sulfate. You have the formula here. So ammonium sulfate is 21.2% of nitrogen and 24.3% of sulfur. As I said, because ammonium sulfate has so much sulfur, I don't want to use it to cover the nitrogen needs, so we are going to use it only to cover the sulfur's need. And by doing so, we just need a very little amount versus if we were covering the nitrogen needs. So here I'm not going through, but it's the same example with the same assumptions. Pitch rate 50 grams per hectoliters, and what I'm trying to do here is to grow my biomass 10 times. Okay. So if I had to resume in 10 seconds, what are the fermentation strategies to produce a neutral alcohol base? I will resume that to 3 strategies that we can use. And the first one actually is ferment with the normal amount of biomass. As nutrient, as we saw in the example before, you can use DAP and some ammonium sulfate for the sulfur. But in this case, you have limited self-grow, and I'm going to show you a few trials that demonstrate these assumptions. And also, it's okay for a max ABV production of 4 or 5% alcohol by volume. But with this, you cannot make high gravity pure sugar fermentation. So on the right of the screen here, you have the pitch rate, a few recommendations of yeast extract to bring some amino acid and vitamins, and of course the main nitrogen source, DAP. There is another strategy that we have seen in the industry, and it's to start the fermentation with a higher biomass concentration. So as you can see here, we are pitching up to 3 or 4 more time yeast than needed for fermentation, in making the assumption that we don't want yeast to grow. We just want the yeast to ferment the sugar in that solution to produce alcohol. So To make that happen, again, you need some vitamins and micronutrients that you can get from yeast extract. You need nitrogen. So as I just said, here you don't want to have cell growth. You're doing it on purpose. It's not because you can, but actually you decided to pitch a lot of yeast. And what we have seen with this strategy is that you can reach a higher ABV than this strategy, but it's not going to work for high gravity pure sugar fermentation. So when you go higher than 25 centiplatos, this strategy doesn't work. And also, you can use a premium nutrient, and we're going to talk a little bit about something we developed that is called spring from NAB2. So here, with this yeast nutrient, you need a normal pitch rate, and then you add the nutrient. And the nutrient is going to bring everything the yeast need to grow in this depleted environment. So we've seen this slide before, and this is a reminder. As I said, the main problems in fermentation, hard seltzer or stock or sluggish fermentation, and also really to end up with the neutral base. I don't want sulfur reduction. I don't want a lot of sulfite for because it's regulated. And people that have run trials will be able to tell you that actually it's not easy in fermenting a high gravity pure sugar solution to have a clean fermentation. Also, something we have seen, as you know, you have to control the pH in a pure sugar solution fermentation, and like in the beer world, that doesn't happen because there are many things that allow the pH to remain stable. But actually, in a pure sugar fermentation, the pH drops very fast, and we see fermentation stall at 1.5, 3% alcohol volume without nutrients. And if you add nutrients, it gets a little bit better. You can reach 5, 6% ABV, but you will have very long fermentations. So, yeah, this slide is here to explain how media acidification work. And I use the example with the nitrogen uptake from the media. I'm going to spend a minute here. So what we're comparing here is how we're comparing actually nitrogen uptake, so amino acid nitrogen versus mineral nitrogen. And long story short, so I don't want to do this too fast that it's not comprehensible, and also I don't want to spend like 10 minutes. But what I will say is that, for example, when I have an amino acid, I need a protein to bring it into the cell. And if I bring a protein to the cell, then I need to kick this guy out of the cell, which for what I need also energy to put it out. So when I use amino acid, what is interesting here, if I take the example of arginine, is that the arginine, this amino acid, it's bringing 4 nitrogen. So this amino acid bring into the cell 4 nitrogen, and to do that, I only need 1 protein. And if I use DAP, so this is ammonium ion, the ammonium ion has only 1 nitrogen, as you can see here. And actually, that ammonium ion into the cell becomes ammoniac and release the protein. And as I said, you need to kick the protein out of the cell. So when you use in yeast nutrition mineral nitrogen, it's, let's say, a lot less efficient for the cell than using amino acids. But also the fact of releasing so much proteins out of the cell is going to produce a fast acidification. Something that I was just saying that we see very often, people reaching out and finding solutions because the base smell like rotten eggs. That's a sulfur problem. So here, what we're trying to do is to end up with a clean base, but then we see a lot of sulfur. And why do we see a lot of sulfur? Is because there is a lack of nutrition, is because there is a lot of cell autolysis due to many stresses, but the main one is being alcohol. A positive thing about sulfur is that they are highly volatile, so you can scrub them with CO2. Another point of attention with sulfurs or sulfur compounds like sulfates, it's that you need to declare them on the label if the concentration is higher than 10 ppm. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, we're targeting here a clean label. I mean, you don't want to put contained sulfates on the label. That's something you want to avoid. So you are looking for a yeast strain and for the right nutrition and the right environment to minimize the yeast production of sulfates. So that's tricky because all the strains produce sulfates, some more, some less, but they all produce. And here, like, you want to keep that lower than 10 ppm. And in our case, we wanted to keep that lower than 10 ppm in a high gravity pure sugar fermentation, so even more complicated. And also other things related to our flavors is like oxidation. That's why I was saying that it's not mandatory, but if you produce a high gravity alcohol base, when you dilute it, the better is to use deaerated water, because if you use normal water that has a lot of oxygen inside, you should see some oxidation in the flavors that you are adding to the base. So let's talk a little bit about the premium nutrient Fermentis has developed, which for the US is going to be NAB2, so stands for neutral alcohol base 2. And also in other countries, we are releasing NAB3. So as you know, nutrients are formulas of different products, and depending on regulations, the formula doesn't work from all the countries. So that's why there are some itinerations. So now let's review some R&D results, and you will see it's quite interesting. So this data that I got from R&D when they were developing the nutrient. And here on the left, you have the trial condition summary. So we started quite a few years ago when all the industry was moving from FMB, fermented malt beverages, to NAB, neutral alcohol base. So an FMB usually will be 25% malt and then 75% dextrose. The pitch rate in this trial was 5 grams per liter, which is the same as 50 grams per hectoliter. Fermentation temperature, 78.8 Fahrenheit. Initial pH, 5.5, so we target the initial pH of a beer wort. And here we tried two strains, Red Star Premier Cuvée and also SAF Spirit HG1. So here on the chart, you have the control. And actually the control is Red Star Premier Cuvée. And we fermented that, this is the fermentation in a 20% media with malt and 75% dextrose without any kind of nutrient. So you can see here the shape of the fermentation. So on this axis you have the days, and on this axis you have the ethanol produced. And you can see that it goes quite high. I mean, the scale goes up to 20% volume by volume. So the control, you can see a kind of slow fermentation, and we reach ABVs around 16% in a long period of time. I mean, 10 days fermentation. And this is not 10-day fermentation at a lager temperature, but we're talking here about 78.8 Fahrenheit. So you are using a lot of energy to get there. And actually, you will end up with a lot of residual sugars, which is something that you don't want. We can see here that actually, so the cross green and red are the same strain, so Premier Cuvée, but in green is the media 2, and in red is the media 1. So you can see that it starts for this strain to get better, and seeing that we have better results to the media 1. And for HG1, again, we tried the 2 medias, M1 and M2, and you can have a faster fermentation. And actually, this strain, which is very tolerant to alcohol, reached 17 ABV. So This was to see how the strains were performing, and also how the different nutritional medias when we were designing NAB2 were helping the yeast to achieve maximum performance. But as I mentioned, at that time, the industry knew that we were going to move to 100% sugar fermentation. And that's kind of not easy, as you saw in all the strains before, for the yeast to ferment. So second trial was like, hey, let's see what happened in a media that is 10% malt, 90% dextrose. So we are removing from the yeast many things here: nutrients, minerals, etc. So same pitch rate, same fermentation temperature, the same strains. And you can see that the control in this case actually reached very low ABV. Actually, fermentation after 12 days barely reached 40% ABV. And you can see again here that HG1 with the media 2 reached 17% ABV, really good. And Premier Cuvée also reached less. I think we're here in 15 point something, and media 2 offering better results than media 1. And in the case of HG1, strain B, yeah, HG1. Yeah, sorry, I think here I mixed up a few things. The strain A, yeah, so this is HG1 and this is Premier Cuvée. HG1 has more alcohol tolerance than Premier Cuvée. So the last scenario, it's pretty much 100% pure sugar fermentation, and here we have 1% malt, 99% dextrose. So in this trial, same fermentation temperatures, same initial pH, and 2 different strains. And as I was telling you, the control here is just Premier Cuvée without any nutrients. And you can see what happened when you have yeast and sugar without nutrients. There is no fermentation. I mean, barely. You have, after 12 days, we move from 0% alcohol to 1.5. Like nothing happened. Why? Because in a pure sugar solution, beside glucose, beside carbon, there is nothing else. There is no nitrogen, no phosphate, no sulfur compounds, or things that the yeast needs to grow and actually ferment. And you can see here that actually with media 1 and 2, actually both strains perform quite well. So what we saw before was lab trials, the former times of developing a premium nutrient. Since late 2019, we have been making some industrial trials in the US, and like first things first, thanks a lot to all our customers that allow us and trust us to perform trials in their facilities. This has been a really interesting process, and actually it's nice to learn how the nutrient is behaving in, I would say, more real-life batch, like 50 bbl of a high, medium-high gravity pure sugar fermentation, depending on the trials. So in this trial, we use HG1, and fermentation temperature was 86 Fahrenheit. Original gravity was 27 Platos, so you can see it here. The sugar used was saccharose, and spring ferment AB2 dosage was 550 grams per hectoliters. So here you have the gravity, here you have the pH, and here you have the time. And you can see actually that thanks to this nutrient, the pH remains stable through the fermentation and doesn't crash to levels that will stall the fermentation. And also, if we talk about the original gravity, we can see that actually in about 6-7 days, we reach almost 100% attenuation. So what we have learned through all these trials is that one of the things we have learned is that we need to develop a better formula to calculate attenuation when we are fermenting pure sugar wash, because all the instruments and all the formulas that are out there for real degree of fermentation, of apparent attenuation, are designed and calibrated for a beer wort, which density is different from a pure sugar solution fermentation. Pure sugar solution fermentation, at the end of fermentation, the density we have, it's a lot closer to water. And what I discovered too, actually watching a few webinars, is that, for example, so here we're talking about gravity, but when you carbonate a hard seltzer, the carbonation tables we have for beer doesn't work very well because, again, the liquid is different. So it seems that there are quite a few charts that we need to build. Okay, let's have a look at another trial. So here you have 3 parameters. In blue, it's original gravity. In orange is the alcohol in volume by volume, and in gray is the pH. So again, here we use HG1. The strain used is HG1, fermentation temperature 86 Fahrenheit, and original gravity 26 Plato. So NAB dosage was again 550 grams per hectoliters. And in this case, you will see what we did here is we did 2 trials. So this trial is we add all the sugar, saccharose. So all the sugar was added into the solution at T equals 0. So we started fermentation at 26 Plato. And you can see that we need, well, they took data up to 14 days, not the best attenuation, but I was telling you we need to actually work better the formula. Interesting things here, as you can see, the pH doesn't crash to a level that is going to harm the yeast. So that's really good, and you can see the nutrient performing well. So from this same trial, we were provided the cell count. So you have here the amount of viable cells, and as you can see here, we start with the pitch rate, 50 grams per hectoliters, which is around 20 million viable cells per ml, and we go up to 100 million cells here. And you can see that, so there is some variability in the cell count. To be honest, I don't have an answer for that. It's just data that we were provided. I think maybe the cell counts were not done in the best way possible. But don't get me wrong, like, we are very happy when customer can provide us data. Any kind of data is very useful. So you can see that actually the nutrient allow biomass to grow, and actually the viability remains well until actually the end of fermentation, about day 12, 13, where because there is no more sugar or little sugars into the solution, the viability start to go down. So from this same brewery, actually we designed another experiment, and it was like, can I improve the fermentation time if I break down my addition of saccharose? So the idea here is that I know that high original gravities add a huge osmotic stress to the yeast. So if I lower my original gravity from 26, this is a typo, here it's 17, but if I lower my original gravity from 26, it was the first experiment, to an original gravity of 16 Plato, and then at day 2 I had more sugar, and then at day 5 I had more sugar. How many days I can gain through this fermentation? So you have the data here, and we gained like 3 days, which was good. Also in this trial, you can see that pH remains stable and alcohol production actually it's well as well. I mean, we're talking about 17%. So the bumps in the gravity line is for the sugar addition. So you have a bump here and a bump here again in the line. And from this second trial, so they missed the cell count at beginning of fermentation, but actually you can see that because the original gravity is lower, we are able to reach more higher cell concentration. So here we reach 150 million cells after 24 hours, and you can see here we're reaching at the same time just 100 million cell. So definitely a lower gravity makes the yeast less stressed, which allow it to grow better and shave some time into the fermentation. That being said, if you break down your sugar additions, that means that process is going to be a lot more labor intensive. So something to analyze if it's worth it or not. Here another trial from a customer actually that use Red Star Premier Cuvée, and actually in a medium gravity works. So you can see here, so you have the gravity on the right, you have the fermentation temperature on the left, and you have the time, the days of fermentation here. So you can see that this customer, his batch size was 30 bbl, sugar wise, he used dextrose. He decided, because this was a lower gravity, so we are starting just at 9.1 plateaus. So he didn't want it to do high gravity. He wanted to just produce enough alcohol for his seltzer, so around 5-6%. So he decided to dose less NAB, so 300 grams per hectoliters. And you can see that actually the nutrient does his work of keeping the pH stable, slightly under 4, but not like close to 3 or lower. You can see that actually, well, we are able to attenuate this sugar solution as the gravity is going down. And like, I think the idea in the trial was to keep the fermentation temperature all the time at 94 Fahrenheit, but that didn't work. You can see the dots here. But all that to say that, so he started December 23, and the last data was collected the 27th, so 4-day fermentation, I mean, super fast. One last thing about these, fast fermentation, and also didn't put it on the slide, but the general feedback we get from customers is that when using this nutrient, they will tell us that it's the cleanest base they have ever tasted or smelled. So let's review other products actually that you can use for production of a base for hard seltzer. So before I dive into that, I would say that here, what we saw before, it's Fermentis Spring Ferm NAB2. This is a one-stop shop solution, it's a turnkey solution. Like pretty much you buy these products to ferment a high gravity pure sugar fermentation, and you don't have to worry about that fermentation stalling, being sluggish, being highly reduced due to the amount of sulfur produced. It's really blend the nutrient with the sugar, and it's going to be trouble-free. So as I was saying, depending on the countries, we need different formulation. For the United States, it's going to be NAB2, and like Spring Ferm NAB2 is 100% mineral-based fermentation aid for pure sugar fermentations. So that's what it is for, as we have seen in all these presentation and kind of NAB3s for other countries. I think we are using this formulation in Europe mainly. So one thing is the nutrient that you get, and it's NAB2. But then to make the fermentation, you need yeast. And for high gravity pure sugar wash, we recommend HE1 or Red Star Premier Cuvée. So you have their characteristic here. HE1 has a higher alcohol tolerance, so I think it's really good for very high gravity. Premier Cuvée does high gravity too, but 1% less than HG1. And also, you have to ferment at a lower temperature, which means that the fermentation is going to be a little bit longer. So from back and forth and reading in many forums about people looking how to do a hard seltzer, I put this here because some people trying to optimize everything, they have told me that they were using harvested yeast from beer production into neutral alcohol-based fermentations. And I mean, that's okay, but then think about this. If you're using yeast coming from a beer wort, that yeast is not gluten-free anymore, as it was here when it was new, or here when it was new. Like Fermentis grow their yeast with sugar beet molasses. So they are gluten-free, but when you ferment beer with them, they are not gluten-free anymore. So actually, if you want to produce a gluten-free hard seltzer, you need new yeast and not yeast coming harvested from a beer fermentation. And also, this is kind of a disclaimer, please don't ask me if we can harvest yeast from high gravity fermentation. Everything is possible, but it's not recommended at all. High gravity fermentation are very stressful to the yeast. We're talking here about 80% or 70% ABV. So believe me, after that, the yeast is so stressed and intoxicated, literally, that you need new yeast to perform another high gravity fermentation. So talking a little bit more about NAB2, yeah, very briefly, it's a nutrient and mineral base, and it's the one-stop shop solution for pure sugar fermentation. So all this is on the technical data sheet of the product. As we need to bring to the fermentation a lot of nitrogen, there is quite some ammonium in this product. So please use it in an open or well-ventilated space, and the person handling the product should use individual protection equipment, so a mask, glove, glasses. As soon as this product touch your face, it's going to react with all the soft tissues in your body that contain water. So it's can create some suffocation problems, irritation, and so on. So all that is on the safety data sheet. But if you use it in a well-ventilated space, there is no problem. So mineral base, the dosage for high gravity, so 27, 30 Platos, 550 grams per hectoliters. The packaging is a case, 10 kilogram case. And for this dosage, basically you need 1 case per 15 BBL sugar wash to produce a high gravity neutral alcohol base that then you will dilute to produce many, many liters of hard seltzer. So how do we recommend to use this product? Actually, we don't want you to boil it, because when you boil this product, you're going to denaturate some of the vitamins that are in the nutrient. And if the vitamins are denaturated, then the yeast don't have them, and then the yeast is not going to perform as well as if the yeast had the vitamins. So you can blend your sugar and water and boil it for sterilization, but then cool it down to 86, 95 Fahrenheit, and then in a non-boiling solution, you add the NAB2. So of course, when we talk about dilution, to have homogeneity, we need recirculation. So 10 minutes of recirculation. Be sure that the nutrient is well diluted and homogeneously diluted into the solution. And in the meantime, you can rehydrate the yeast separately in water, 10 times its volume. Let it rest for 10-15 minutes. Rehydration temperature we recommend 90, 95 Fahrenheit. and then you can pitch the yeast into the solution. So, as I was saying, for high gravity, we recommend HE1 and Red Star Premier Cuvée. If you want to go low gravity, touch base with us because there are many other options. But HE1 and Premier Cuvée are the two best options for high or very high gravity sugar fermentations. So, through this trial campaign, we realized that we designed a product for industrial brewing and for people that has all the infrastructure to be highly efficient, which means high gravity fermentation, that also can produce a lot of dehydrated water, that have a centrifuge to remove the yeast after the end of fermentation. And what we're seeing in the last 6 months, it's a lot of smaller breweries with not all that fancy equipment that want to produce seltzer, and they will come back to us like, hey, well, I mean, the product works well, but I don't need to do high gravity. What do you have for me? So the good answer is that even if you don't want, even if Spring Ferm NAB2 is not for you, we got you covered. So this is most from our wine portfolio. We have a wide range of fermentation aids. And the good thing here is that most of them are dry, but also we have liquid fermentation aids that are kind of a blessing for inline dosage. And if you go this pathway, you need DAP, so mineral nitrogen, and then also you need all these fermentation aids with our mainly yeast derivatives. And this is an approach, as I was saying, for low gravity neutral alcohol-based production. So here I put this reminder again. If you can harvest from high gravity. Low gravity I haven't tried yet, but I don't know. But also careful, if you harvest yeast from beer wort and use it for hard seltzer production, then your hard seltzer is not gluten-free. So very careful about that, because if you label your product gluten-free and it's not, you can get in trouble for that. So for the next 10 minutes, and I'm getting close to the end of this presentation, let's take a look about why yeast derivatives, or which is the fermentation aids we have in Fermentis wine portfolio, are interesting for the fermentation. And I'm going to start from the bottom of the slide, and here we have a drawing of yeast. And I would say that actually most yeast derivatives are interesting for fermentation because what we have inside the cell, it's really good for the yeast itself. And actually, sorry, a yeast derivative is a good way to source organic nitrogen and many of the vitamins and micronutrients we need for the fermentation. So we have the drawing of a yeast cell here, and then if we zoom, we break it down in membrane, periplasmic space, and so on. So now let's jump to the right of the slide. And I'm going to explain it in the next slide, actually, but a yeast derivative, it's yeast that we autolyze in a controlled way. And when we autolyze and we highly degrade the cytoplasm of the yeast, that gives us a good access to free amino acids, nucleotides, nucleosides, that, as we know, are very important for the fermentation. Talking about the membrane, if I don't degrade a lot the membrane of the yeast when I produce the yeast derivatives, that will give me high absorption capabilities to detoxify the media. So this comes from the wine portfolio, so we put must. But generally, like yeast membrane that's not degraded has a very detoxifying power of the media by absorption. And if I highly degrade the membrane, That will give me access to a lot of unsaturated fatty acids, so very important to produce more biomass, as well as sterols and soluble lipids. So to help the membrane structure, but also to fight ethanol toxicity. And talking about the cell wall of the yeast, when it's non-degraded, that gives me access to a glucan network and neutral polysaccharide with, again, huge absorption capabilities to detoxify the media from toxic compounds, and toxic compounds doesn't allow fermentation. So a few things you need to know if you're not familiar with yeast derivative. If there is people in the audience from the cider and wine world that are very familiar with this, usually people from the beer industry are not at all familiar with this, again, because the beer world has everything for yeast to ferment, and fruit juice in general don't have a lot of the micro and macronutrients that yeast needs. So I'm going to explain very quickly how we produce a yeast derivative. And the first step is to produce yeast. We grow yeast. And then when we have all the yeast we want, so specific strains, we have a yeast cream. And then actually, like through temperature, we're going to inactivate this yeast. And give me a second. Sorry, let me start again. So as I was saying here, we have the yeast cream, and like through a heat process that it's called plasmolysis, we're going to inactivate the yeast. So you don't want a yeast derivative to ferment. That's why you buy activated dry yeast. So first step, inactivate the yeast, kill the yeast. Second step, we're going to put the yeast into the right environment to allow it to use its own enzymes to degrade itself. And we're going to obtain a partial yeast autolysate. But if we keep pushing this forward, we can also obtain a total yeast autolysate. And a total yeast autolysate has two fractions. We have the yeast hull, and then we have the yeast extract. So just so you know, yeast hull does not have nitrogen. We're talking here about detox power. And partial yeast autolysate or yeast extract have nitrogen content. So if you look at the general composition here, you can see, well, the kind of yeast derivative we have. So yeast hull, classic yeast extract, total yeast autolysate, partial yeast autolysate, and inactivated yeast, and what each of them brings you. So this is very important. The higher the solubility, the higher the solubility of the yeast extract, the more the yeast will be able to use, because if it's not soluble in the media, then it cannot be used by the yeast. You can also see here the amount of fat matter each of these yeast autolysate has, the amount of amino nitrogen and vitamins. So this is the same as slide 33, but no, we're not there. We're not there yet. Sorry. But again, this is I took it from UC Davis, and on this chart, this is wine. You can see different fermentation lines. So the red is what you want. All these is just problems. So an optimal fermentation, and sorry, this is a bit of repetition, but I think it's needed. Optimal fermentation means that we have the optimal conditions for the yeast growth, and also that we have the optimal condition for the yeast to ferment. So on this side is who says yeast grow means the right amount of yeast, viable yeast, and also the right condition means that when I have all these biomass, I'm going to allow them to ferment the sugars in the media. So different problems because of different reasons. I would say mainly nitrogen deficiencies. It's the limitation. But the most important thing about this slide is that beware of the combination of factors. Usually, factors are synergic rather than additive. So 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, but 3 or 4. And we see that in many fermentation. It's not because you fix one variable that the fermentation will happen, like if you don't fix the other variables, but actually there is an additive effect. And also, like high temperature, okay, allows you to ferment very fast and efficiency, but is stress for the yeast. Also, high gravity is stress for the yeast, and of course, lack of nitrogen, not good, and toxin also no good. So this is the same as slide 33, where I show you all the building blocks in biomass production. This is a different way to see that same slide, but I think it's important. And like for yeast growth, we need micronutrients. So you see again here, carbon, nitrogen, phosphate, sulfur. I didn't talk about survival factors. We talk about a lot about this in wine, but not sure that it's the case for pure sugar wash. And micronutrients, which are vitamins and some minerals like manganese, magnesium, zinc. So you need actually all these to allow yeast to produce biomass. And also, this is again repetition, sorry about that, but I think it's needed. You need to provide the right conditions of temperature, of pH, alcohol, and so on. And in the case of a pure sugar wash, we should be worried about buffering, the fermentation with a phosphate buffer or carbonate buffer to keep the pH where the yeast want to be. So going back to yeast derivative, I'm missing something here, but it's okay. So talking back to yeast derivative, we're going to go through this slide, and you can see that yeast derivatives are not only a source of organic nitrogen, but also they bring many things that you need into the fermentation, and that can be hard to source if you're looking for those specific compounds, such as vitamins, microminerals, and so on. And the thing is that the yeast derivative, if you look at the amount of nitrogen they contain, it's not a lot, actually. It's not a lot, but it's a lot more efficient to use by the yeast than DAP. So after back and forth for like many years with wineries, we decided to come up with a concept that is the fermentative power of our yeast derivatives. So long story short, when we talk about nitrogen for fermentation, everybody use DAP, the ammonium phosphate, and it's cheap. Yeast derivatives are more expensive, and in absolute values, they contain less nitrogen. So why will you pay a premium for less nitrogen? So the thing is that actually organic nitrogen, it's a lot more efficient to use by the yeast than the DAP. So it's what we're going to see in the next slide. And just to showcase that a little bit, here we have some commercial products that we sell here in the US. So this is a dry yeast derivative, Spring Firm. Then we have Spring Firm Extreme, and then we have a liquid yeast derivative, which is vinyl liquid. And actually, yeah, Spring Firm is partially autolysate, and Spring Firm is total yeast autolysate. And to put things simple, vinyl liquid is the liquid form of Spring Firm Extreme. And you can see here that actually the yen equivalent of these products is 10 ppm, 20 ppm, and 20 ppm. And and the yen equivalent in percentage is 5, 10, and 11.5. Okay, so I think a trial it's better than 1,000 words. And here is all trials on different musts of wine. And what we're doing in this first trial is really to demonstrate this fermentative power concept. And we're trying here side by side mineral nitrogen, so DAP, versus organic nutrients at 1/3 of the alcoholic fermentation. And on this axis, actually, we are following fermentation, but the flow of CO2 in real time. So it's what it's done a lot in wine fermentation. Instead of following the extract decrease, we have fermentation vessels set up on scales, and like that, you can really monitor the production of CO2. And you can see a peak here, and that peak is called Smax. So Smax is the maximum CO2 production by the yeast, and that tells us actually that was the peak of the fermentation activity. So in blue you have the control, and actually the control is no addition of DAP or no addition of yeast derivative. We just pitched the yeast into a wine must that has some nitrogen, that has some phosphate, but for sure it's not what all the yeast need to ferment. And you can see here that the blue line actually goes here, 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 and actually we never reach complete attenuation. And if we look at these two peaks here, it's when we add nutrients at 1/3 of alcoholic fermentation. And in yellow here, you have the DAP, the ammonium phosphate, and here you have the yeast derivative. So both applied in the same juice at the same time, of course, different fermentation vessels. And what we can see here is that, for example, with DAP, we really bump up the yeast activity. So we have a second Smax higher with DAP than with the yeast derivatives. But then in the long term, if we look overall at the fermentation, you cannot see very well here, but actually here we have the time gain versus controlling fermentation. And we can see that with DAP, we gain 21% fermentation time versus the control. But with the yeast derivative, we gain 55% of fermentation time over the control. And actually, we also gain fermentation time versus DAP, the ammonium phosphate addition. So now that we realize that actually yeast derivative in a fermentation, so this coming from the wine industry, but it's pretty confident that it's pretty usable in a pure sugar wash. Now that we demonstrated that actually yeast derivative are more efficient in a fermentation than the simple use of DAP, let's see what are the difference between a partial versus a total yeast autolysate. And in this case, actually, the partial yeast autolysate is a spring firm, and we're comparing it to a total yeast autolysate, which is spring firm extreme. So remember here that the higher the autolysation of the products, the higher his solubility, so the easier it is to use by the yeast. That's why total yeast autolyzed perform better in fermentation than partial yeast autolyzed. So you can see the trial here. Again, on this axis, we have the CO2 production. Down here, we have the time. In yellow, we have spring firm extreme. So the test is like the control. So we pitch the yeast, but no addition of any kind of nutrient. And in orange here, we have a spring firm. So it's hard to see on the chart. But again, the partial yeast autolysate offer again time versus the control of 7%. But then the total yeast autolysate offer a gain of fermentation time of 13%. So the total yeast autolysate, it performs better than the partial yeast autolysate. So, okay, this is another trial where we are seeing the impact of yeast also detoxification compounds in the must, and assessing how they impact fermentation times for good or bad. And then we are also seeing what happened by itself with the yeast extracts. And then we are looking at what happened when I add the two together. So very quickly on it, I'm going to jump right to the conclusion. Yeast derivative without nitrogen can help fermentation by providing survival factor and detoxifying the mast from toxic fatty acids. So I think these need to be assessed in a pure sugar solution, but I decided to put this slide here. Which brings me actually to one of the final slide, which is a focus on vinyl liquid, which is a total yeast liquid autolyzed. So very easy to use in big breweries because you can dose it inline. And as I said, vinyl liquid is the liquid form of the dry yeast total autolysate, which is a Springford Extreme. And well, same type of trials. I'm going to jump directly to the conclusions. So at least on my screen, this is kind of a green color is the control. Well, in this kind of pink control, we have the O2 additions. Here is O2 plus dry autolysate. And so in kind of magenta magenta. And in yellow is O2 plus vinyl liquid, which is the liquid yeast autolysate. So pretty much what we're doing here is comparing the same product, but we're comparing his dry form versus his liquid form. And what we can see is that with vinyl liquid, I shortened the fermentation time by 42% versus the control. And then also, down here, this is the difference in the fermentation time between the dry autolysate and vinyl liquid. And you can see that for the same product in the liquid time, I shaved 10% of fermentation time just because I'm using the liquid form. So that's something to keep in mind. So this is for you to have as a reference. Here you have our commercial products with their names. I kind of circle because this is the same like this, but this is a dry form, this is a liquid form. As I mentioned before, the solubility of the product is very important. These two are very soluble, so they're going to be very easy to use by the yeast. And here also I put what is the amount of amino nitrogen and B vitamins that these two products add. So if you're looking for some of them, like that, you have the name and what they can do, and you can touch base with us. We're almost at the end. I'm going just to fly through these slides. After we produce the neutral alcohol base, I would say that if you're a large brewery, you will use a centrifuge to get rid of the yeast. If you don't have a centrifuge, biofine and cold temperatures will be your friend. And also you will try to use a yeast that has a good flocculation, but most important, a good sedimentation. And then, like secondarily, we will try to clean the base mainly with activated carbon, but also, there is all kind of fancy machinery to do this. And if you add activated carbon, also you can filter the base with diatomeous earth. So flavoring. I'm not going to talk about this. The best advice is that reach out to a flavoring house. They have been in that business for many, many years, and they will tell you all the difference between all the aromas they have. But pretty much for a hard seltzer, you have endless possibilities. And also, like some people are starting to add fruit during or post fermentation. Why not? So shelf life stability, I will say keep it cold. If you have the equipment pasteurized, back sweetening is possible, but then you run into re-fermentation risk. So what we see more often is that the industry, like the hard seltzer production leaders, are using citric acid to lower the pH of the final product for microbiological stability. So this is interesting because I need a specific pH to let the yeast ferment. But when fermentation is completed, I want to acidify the product to avoid any kind of fermentation. But if you ask me what people are using to make the product shelf stable, like if you can pasteurize, just be sure to lower the pH with citric acid to a point that you're sure nothing is going to grow. You can use also potassium metabisulfite. So on the paper, it looks okay, but then you have to declare it on the label if it's higher than 10 ppm. And like, I don't know, I don't think it makes sense to have to label potassium metabisulfate because you are going over 10 ppm on a hard seltzer. So I personally, I will not use these, but you can also you can use potassium sorbate. So these are the references from somewhere the information is taken. And if you have questions, please send us an email to this email, fermentis.us@lesaf.com. Tell us your name, contact info, and also the states in the US you are located at, or if you are from abroad the US, the country where you are from, to connect you with the Fermentis people that take care of that country. And I will finish by saying that if you have questions, if you want samples to give a shot to NAB2 or other yeast derivative, please write to us and we will be happy to mail this to you. And with that being said, I'm done with this presentation.
Can you hear me? Jose?
Kevin?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Sick. Thank you, Jose. That was great. I mean, a lot of information, a lot of time spent, almost exactly the 2 hours. As Jose said, I think I don't think we have time for any questions right now, unless we go over the time.
I mean, I have plenty of time, so it's okay.
Okay.
Let's, I don't know if Marcelo can connect as well.
There was one question. I've been answering kind of the more generic questions throughout, just responding directly to the people that have asked questions in the chat. There's one question here, which is, which pH do you recommend for microbiological stability with citric acid? That is not answered yet.
Oh, good point. I would say I should check again what is the pH in the cans of White Claw, but I think it's around 3. Yeah, 2.83. That will give you. Say that again, Marcelo?
Yes, close to that. Yes.
Close to that, yeah. So that will give you a microbiological stability. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. Somebody is asking to see the reference page again.
It's yeah. Actually, we're going to send by individual emails the PDF of these presentations. So that will follow next week, and you will have that. Yeah, not right now, but in a week or so.
There's a question that I don't fully understand. The sugar of the fruit helps in the fermentation? ?
No, I suppose the question is what happens with the sugars that are coming from fruit during the fermentation. Okay, if the nutrition is okay, if the conditions are good, those sugars will be also fermented. Okay, but the risk is that if you put fruit at the end of the fermentation and then you pack your seltzer, it may contain some sugars that can be fermented in the can, for example. That could be dangerous. Okay, so it's we also recommend to add all the sugars coming from fruit in a time during the fermentation where it can be completely fermented. Okay.
Patrick Zanello is writing a question, or maybe a comment.
No.
Question of how much gluten would you say is in a hard seltzer made with our beer yeast? That we honestly cannot answer. Of course, it's going to depend on the raw materials used in the beer. For gluten-reduced beer, if you're talking about using the enzymes, I don't know that any would be detectable if you repitch into a seltzer.
Yeah, it's a tough.
Do you suggest NAB?
Sorry, I was saying that's a tough question. I think it's better to be safe and to not use yeast that has fermented in beer wort, like really to use new yeast for hard seltzer production, like that you're sure that you are trouble-free.
So I think that question, they may be asking if they're using one of our brewing strains. So if it's a fresh pitch of one of our yeasts, it would be a gluten-free at that point. So what Jose was saying during the presentation is yeast harvested from a beer would contain gluten, just to clarify that.
There's a question. Do you suggest NAB2 for medium strength seltzers like 5 to 8% ABV? If yes, do you suggest a lower pitch rate than 550 grams per hectoliter that was suggested for the high gravity seltzer?
Good question.
Yeah. And also, I will clarify, when we talk about NAB2, it's not pitch rate. The product does not have yeast. We're talking about dosage rate. So the pitch rate was never like 550 grams per hectoliters, but that is the dosage rate. And the pitch rate recommended for that high gravity is 50 grams per hectoliter of yeast. Marcelo, I let you elaborate on the low ABVs seltzer.
Actually, we don't know exactly. We have been running fermentations that the intention is to reach about 5-8% of alcohol with lower quantities of NAB2. We don't have exactly at this moment which is the recommended concentration, but because in fact there are a lot of minerals that cannot be decreased proportionally as regarding to the alcohol concentration you have to reach. This is not proportional. This is what we know. But I know that some fermentations were run with less nutrient and it really worked very well. We don't have really a good recommendation for the moment, but we will get to that point soon. Okay. There's a question in Spanish here for me. So maybe I can respond, Sebastian. I can respond to you later if you can in Spanish. No problem about that. But maybe I can answer in English. Just let me read the question. So he's asking if when we add fruit to the fermentation to add some flavors, of course. We look for those sugars we consider those sugars for the fermentation. Of course, here you can add fruits, so no problem about that. And you can also have a product sweet by the end of fermentation. It's your decision, basically. But if you want to claim that you have a product in the shelf with low residual sugars, you need to ferment those sugars. But in addition to that, I think, and really very important, is that if you have sugars at the end of the fermentation, then be careful, because if you don't pasteurize a product, if you don't stabilize the product, then you may have a re-fermentation, and then you know what happens. So cans will be exploding. So that's the risk. Okay, if you add sugars, you need to ferment the sugars, or you need to stabilize the beverage.
There's a question from Jeff. touching on Jeremy's question, would you suggest Saf Spirit HG for 5 to 8% ABV seltzer?
Do you want to answer that, Kevin?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, sure. So with HG1, the reason that we selected that for the high gravity was because we know that's very alcohol tolerant. It's relatively neutral of a yeast strain, but it doesn't mean that you have to use it for high gravity. That yeast strain will work perfectly fine at lower gravity as well, producing a neutral base the same, or maybe even more neutral at the low gravity just because of the reduction in stress. But yeah, it would be perfectly suitable. We've actually run some trials with HG1 in the lower alcohol target NAB trials that we've done that Marcelo was referencing before. So we know it works. We know that it's very neutral. We know that it's clean. So yes, of course, you can use that in a 5 to 8% alcohol.
So there's another question: when we will have the yeast in Argentina? So the yeast is in Argentina, so you can get it there in the local market. But we are today registering the product with the local authorities. Okay. The product is already in the US and some other countries that really don't require a long registration process. But in some countries, we need to go through the local authorities.
There's a question, is it necessary to mix water and sugar in the kettle, then cooling to the cylindrical conical tank, or mix it with ambient temperature? I can answer that. As long as you can fully dissolve the sugar in water, you can mix it in ambient temperature. The bigger reason why you do it in the kettle is so that you could bring it to a boil to sanitize, to sterilize the sugar-water mixture before cooling it to your fermenter, but you could very well mix it at ambient temperature in your fermenter.
So
I think
Chris, friend, yeah.
Sorry.
Why did you measure
think
CO2 flow? Yeah, in the performance study and not sugars. Okay, you can answer, Anne, or I can do it.
Sure, I can answer. I'm assuming we're talking about the trials made on the wine.
Yeah.
There. So by measuring CO2, you can really see very well. It's a very accurate way to follow fermentation, and you can really identify at what phase you are. Specifically, you have the S max, and for us, these are key phases that indicates at what stage the yeast is in fermentation. So it's a very accurate and precise way to know when you want to add the different type of nutrients and oxygen. So that's the way, the most accurate way to follow fermentation.
Yeah, just to add some information, you know that the main products of the fermentation are ethanol and CO2. So you can measure CO2 to see the progress of the fermentation, and that will give you information about the physiological state of the yeast. So stationary phase, exponential phase, and then you can make decisions based on that, because the addition of nutrients, for example, is not the same at the different stages of the fermentation. So that's very important. You can measure real-time fermentation and what is going on in the fermentation in real time. That's very nice technology.
There's a question from Ryan that says, should we be lowering the suggested amount of yeast nutrient if a lot of fruit puree is being added, like a seltzer smoothie, for instance? I'm not sure if you're wanting a sweet product at the end. If you are, then I would guess, yeah, add less nutrient to slow or stall the fermentation, but I don't know why you'd want to do that.
Maybe,
No, I
maybe
think, yeah, to decrease the nutrients. Sorry.
maybe the question comes, if I add fruit puree, is it bringing nutrients with it?
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
Maybe that's how I read the question.
We don't know how much.
I just
for
think
sure,
with a smoothie.
I don't believe you can assume that any fruit puree is bringing any enough nutrient or buffering capacity to replace nutrients, but I'm not sure if my teammates would have another opinion.
No, for sure, you will be adding minerals, maybe some vitamins. We don't know how it was processed, but of course, it's difficult to measure that. Okay? I think the best is to do trials and to find the right dose of nutrient of Spring Farm and AB2 when you add this kind of purees.
Is the addition of flavors before or after carbonation?
I think I'm not an expert in that part of the process, Kevin, but I think it should be before you carbonate. In fact, the carbonation, you can keep the carbonation from the fermentation, and then you add the flavors. So the product is already carbonated, and then you filter.
I mean, you could do it either way, as long as you have the equipment to do it. Obviously, if you're adding flavors after carbonation, you're going to need a vessel that can handle the pressure and higher pressure to push. I mean, you can dilute it into a carbonated water, like a diluent water, and then push that into your tank. But it's going to involve some equipment that's high pressure tolerant, or you could do it before carbonating. The only concern with before carbonating is if you do blow some CO2 off, you could be reducing the amount of volatiles that are still in the tank, but usually that's not a problem.
So
I think we can take. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, another question from Sebastian. While we wait for the ideal yeast to arrive to Argentina, what yeast we can use to test? So again, the yeast is in Argentina, so you can buy it, but the nutrient is it's going through a process. You can contact your friend Diego Perrota. I'm sure you know him from Argentina. He can give you information and the protocol to follow. Okay.
Yeah, I think, Marcelo, we can say that an AB2 is in our warehouse in the United States as we speak. So, like, if someone from the audience want to sample, would take us like 3 days to get it to your brewery. So very convenient. So don't be shy. I dropped the email in the chat already, so use it.
Okay, guys. I don't think we have.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah. Probably not. So thank you very much to everybody. So I hope this will help to develop your products. And please, you can contact us if you have any question.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.